If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
The operation that would later be known as Tidal Wave began not with fanfare, but with a grim briefing inside a sweltering tent in Benghazi, Libya. American airmen, many of them still in their early 20s, gathered before maps and photos pinned to boards, trying to make sense of a mission so ambitious it defied precedent. The target was Ploesti, Romania, the heart of Hitler's fuel empire, a sprawling complex of refineries that provided nearly a third of the German war machine's gasoline. Destroying it would cripple the Wehrmacht's ability to wage mechanized war, stalling its tanks, trucks, and aircraft. But Ploesti was no soft target. It was one of the most heavily defended sites in Europe, ringed by radar stations, anti-aircraft guns, and uniquely, thousands of balloon barrage cables that would turn low-flying aircraft into scrap. Yet General Louis Brereton and the planners of the 9th Air Force believed that a low-level surprise attack from North Africa, across the Mediterranean, then inland through enemy territory, offered the best chance to hit the refineries before defenders could react. The mission would stretch the operational range of the B-24 Liberator nearly to its limit, requiring fuel economy that left little margin for error and pilots trained to skim treetops for over 1,000 miles. The men who would fly this mission listened in silence as the plan unfolded. A strike force of 178 bombers, organized into 5 groups, each with specific targets spread across the Ploesti complex. Losses were predicted to be catastrophic, as high as 50%, but the mission was deemed worth the cost. Among those listening was Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, commander of the 93rd Bomb Group, known for discipline, precision, and a refusal to be intimidated by odds. His B-24, dubbed Hell's Wench, would lead one of the assault elements. For Baker, this was not just another sortie, it was a strategic gamble that could alter the trajectory of the war. He understood that success required not merely bravery, but exact timing, flawless navigation, and tight formation flying under fire. The crews spent their final days preparing for the raid, rehearsing low-level flying tactics, modifying aircraft, and memorizing target zones that most had never seen firsthand. They joked, smoked, and wrote letters home, but beneath the casual surface lay an unspoken awareness. They were about to attempt one of the most dangerous air operations ever conceived, and many of them would not return.
The convoy of B-24 Liberators lifted off from Benghazi at dawn, engines thundering in synchronized defiance of the 1,200-mile journey ahead. From the start, the mission demanded discipline. Altitude had to be kept low, fuel consumption monitored, and formations tightly maintained to prevent stragglers from being picked off once they crossed into hostile territory. The Mediterranean passed beneath them like a steel plate, featureless and vast, offering no room for correction should an aircraft suffer a mechanical failure. For hours, the formation pushed northward, hugging the waves, then climbing only when the coast of Greece materialized on the horizon. The crews worked in tense quiet, scanning instruments, watching their wingmen, maintaining the delicate balance between speed and fuel efficiency. Navigation was everything. A deviation now meant arriving at Ploesti at the wrong time, hitting the wrong target, or flying straight into the densest anti-aircraft zones. Fate intervened brutally over the rugged spine of the Balkan Mountains. Turbulence rocked the formation, scattering the bombers across uneven air currents. In the lead element, the 376th Bomb Group's navigator collapsed from oxygen failure and heat exhaustion, slumping over his charts in the cramped, stifling nose compartment. The crew tried desperately to revive him, but he remained unconscious. The one man responsible for guiding the leading formation through a maze of valleys and landmarks was suddenly gone. In the chaos, the group commander hesitated, attempting to maintain course while dealing with the emergency, and the timing of the mission began to unravel. Conflicting compass readings, faulty instruments, and the absence of a functioning navigator forced the bombers to improvise route decisions on the fly. A formation designed to move like a single organism began to stretch and deform, with elements drifting out of position and becoming vulnerable. The critical advantage of surprise, the one factor that could compensate for Ploesti's overwhelming defenses, slowly slipped away. Ahead, the flak towers waited, unaware of the approaching armada, but the cracks forming in the plan would soon thrust hundreds of American airmen into a disaster from which not all would emerge.
The moment the formation crossed into Romania, the mission unfolded with a precision that was equal parts calculated and fragile. By this point, every bomber was burning fuel faster than anticipated, and the navigational disruption from the loss of the lead navigator had already shifted the formation several minutes behind schedule. What the crews did not know was that this delay would intersect with the worst possible outcome. The German air defense network was rotating alert shifts, a gap that the original timing would have exploited. Instead, the bombers were now flying toward Ploesti at the exact moment its gunners were ready, rested, and expecting retaliation after months of Allied reconnaissance. The terrain ahead, ridges, farms, and industrial sprawl, was supposed to guide them visually toward individual targets, but under low-level flight conditions, identifying landmarks became nearly impossible. Fields looked like fields, smokestacks blurred into the horizon, and the vital river bend, a key navigational cue, was mistaken for an irrigation channel by the substitute navigator. The lead group veered north, dragging the following aircraft with it, unaware that their route no longer led toward the intended refinery. They were now flying toward Bucharest, straight through a corridor heavily fortified with anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and defensive balloons. Major John "Baldy" Baker, flying in the slot position behind the misdirected lead group, recognized the disaster unfolding in front of him before anyone else did. Unlike most commanders, Baker had memorized not only his assigned target, but the alternate emergency routes, a burden he carried because he never trusted plans that required perfect execution. When he saw the lead element drift off course, ignoring both time marks and terrain cues, he realized the mission had lost its brain. The convoy was marching into a kill zone, and the mistake would doom all of them unless someone broke formation, a violation of doctrine, discipline, and Baker's own orders. He weighed his choices in seconds: follow the group into predictable slaughter, or split his wing and risk fragmentation, miscommunication, and friendly fire collisions at treetop altitude. Baker's co-pilot pleaded to wait for a correction. Baker refused. He throttled forward, rocked his wings sharply, and signaled his subordinate aircraft to follow his breakaway maneuver. In doing so, he knowingly assumed the mantle of rogue leader, but more importantly, he seized the last opportunity to salvage the mission. His gamble would separate his men from the main formation just before it plunged into one of the deadliest anti-aircraft traps in Europe, setting the stage for a new plan improvised under fire, on the fly, at the worst possible moment. But it was a decision that would save hundreds of lives, even as it cost him control of the skies around him.
Baker's breakaway maneuver bought his formation time, but it did not buy them safety. The moment they turned back toward Ploesti, the terrain ahead climbed into rolling ridges and clusters of factories wrapped in heavy anti-aircraft defenses. German spotters, alerted by the sudden change in aircraft direction, recalibrated fire control systems designed specifically for low-flying bombers. Within seconds, black bursts of flak erupted in tight, disciplined patterns. Not the random sky-filling chaos seen in high-altitude engagements, but rapid-fire grids built to anticipate where a bomber would be 1 second later. Each explosion was the size of a car, throwing jagged metal in every direction. And flying barely 60 feet above the ground meant there was no vertical margin to escape. The first hit came fast. A burst detonated beneath the left wing of the bomber Texas Comet, shredding hydraulic lines and igniting fuel vapor in a brief, white-hot flash. The aircraft yawed violently, skimmed the top of a barn, then slammed nose first into a field, exploding with a dull, heavy thump that shook windows miles away. There was no time to mourn. The rest of the formation flew straight into a zone shadowed by barrage balloons, monstrous gas-filled sentinels anchored by steel cables almost invisible until they sliced into metal. Their purpose wasn't to destroy bombers outright, but to force them upward into the killing range of the guns. The crews faced a nightmare that no training had prepared them for. When Baker's formation entered the maze of balloons, the sky was suddenly a forest of wires, drifting gently yet lethally, designed to tear wings clean off with surgical indifference. Pilots ducked instinctively, but instinct was worthless at 200 miles per hour. Baker shoved the yoke forward, hugging the earth so tightly the propeller tips kicked up dust. His wingmen followed, but not all made it. The bomber Lucky Lou clipped a cable with its stabilizer, shearing metal like tissue paper. For a surreal moment, it stayed airborne, wobbling like a mortally wounded bird, before losing lift and cartwheeling into a field of crops. The explosion sucked the oxygen out of nearby cockpits. A gunner on another plane, watching from his open hatch, screamed into his radio even though he knew no one could save them. The Germans exploited this chaos with merciless precision, aiming flak cannons to herd the formation back upward into the balloon cluster. Baker countered by weaving between smokestacks, water towers, and buildings, using the industrial terrain itself as cover. It was insane flying, but it kept them alive. By the time they broke through to the refinery complex, the formation was smaller, battered, and silent, carrying the weight of the dead, but still intact enough to strike. What awaited them ahead was no safer: a wall of fire, smoke, and gunfire that would turn desperate flying into close-quarters combat. The mission wasn't just dangerous anymore, it was unsustainable, but there was no turning back, not with the refinery in sight and their fallen comrades burning behind them.
Baker's reduced and shaken formation burst through the industrial haze like a flock of wounded animals, and the refinery, the giant reason for this suicidal mission, finally revealed itself. It wasn't a target so much as a fortress, a sprawl of cracking towers, fuel silos, and rail lines spewing dark smoke from decoy fires lit hours before the raid. German engineers and commanders had studied American doctrine. They knew low-level bombers needed clear visual markers, so they hid the key fuel processing units behind a camouflage of flame and haze. But Baker, flying with one engine coughing and the fuselage full of holes, recognized the telltale shapes beneath the deception.
tall distillation columns and pipeline arteries feeding Nazi oil production deeper into Europe. Those structures weren't just metal, they were gasoline, tanks, planes, armies. Destroying them meant crippling entire fronts. There was no time to coordinate. Radios crackled with half-heard directions, curses, prayers. Baker signaled with his wings, the old improvised gesture pilots used when machines, not men, failed. The remaining bombers formed up, battered silhouettes against a burning sky, lining up for an attack run so low they risked collision with the refinery itself. Anti-aircraft guns opened with a frightening calm, as if the defenders had calculated this exact moment and were simply executing a script. The air turned into a cage of red tracers, sparks, and shrapnel. One burst tore through the nose of Queen Bee, killing the bombardier instantly. His body slumped over the bomb site even as the pilot released the payload. Another round punched through the cockpit of Kismet, severing control lines and sending the plane drifting sideways, wings clipping smokestacks, before it detonated in a blast that rattled Baker's teeth. But the bombs hit, and when they did, they tore open the heart of the refinery. A chain reaction fed by metric tons of stored fuel erupted into a column of fire hundreds of feet high, turning daylight into orange night. The sky filled with debris, flaming oil and fragments of aircraft, all falling together, American, German, steel, flesh, into the industrial graveyard below. Baker flew through the shockwave, blinded by smoke and heat, trusting muscle memory more than visibility. He couldn't hear his engines anymore, only wind screaming through bullet holes. His gunners fired blindly into smoke as German fighters swooped in, picking off stragglers like wolves chasing maimed elk. Baker didn't evade. He couldn't, so he did the only thing left. He committed fully. He shoved his crippled B-24 even lower, skimming the tops of fuel tanks, forcing the attacking fighters to break off or crash. Metal screamed in protest. Flames licked the wings. The smell of burning fuel mixed with flesh. Behind him, the refinery continued to explode in rolling concussive waves. Explosions so large they disrupted pursuit, rattling anti-aircraft crews and throwing fighters off alignment. The refinery wasn't just damaged, it was annihilated, its fuel production capacity erased in a single violent hour. But the price was beyond tactical. It was human, visceral, irretrievable. Of the bombers that began the attack run, barely a fraction remained. Each one gutted, leaking, haunted. Baker's aircraft, now more whole than machine, limped away from Ploesti, trailing smoke and fuel vapor. The crew too exhausted to speak. No one cheered. No one claimed victory. They had done what history would later call heroic, but in that moment, as they flew through fire toward an uncertain horizon, it felt like nothing but survival mixed with grief. They had achieved the mission, but only by feeding the refinery with their lives.
Baker's remaining bombers staggered away from the burning refinery like a small convoy of wounded vessels trying to outrun a tidal wave. Engines leaked oil, control surfaces fluttered with broken hinges, and many turrets were jammed or empty. Inside the cockpit, the air smelled of hydraulic fluid and burned insulation, and Baker's co-pilot was pale from blood loss, gripping the yoke with one hand and his side with the other. They weren't flying anymore. They were trying not to fall. Behind them, the refinery continued to erupt, its explosions visible even through the dense smoke they left behind. It should have bought them time, but their destroyers, the German fighters, weren't finished. The Bf-109s and Fw-190s rose from airfields surrounding Ploesti, in coordinated swarms, everywhere at once, fresh and hungry. They weren't interested in dogfighting. They were executing a purge. Their mission was simple: kill everything that remained. Baker called for a climb, anything to regain altitude before fighters closed, but the engine sputtered and dropped RPMs, coughing like a wounded animal. They were too heavy, too damaged, and too low. Staying low meant AA guns. Climbing meant fighters. There was no right answer. Baker chose the one aligned with instinct: survive the next minute, then the next, and pray the plane lasted long enough for a miracle to become a plan. The bomber's wounded waist gunners braced themselves, heads pressed against cold metal, listening for the sound of fighters diving, the whistle, the rattle, the scream. Then it came. 4 109s diving from the sun, timed to hit the rear of the formation exactly when the bombers were blind. The first bursts stitched the tail of Marauder, detonating oxygen tanks and peeling the fuselage open like a banana. Crewmen tumbled out, arms flailing, falling like ash from a burning log. No parachutes deployed. The second bomber caught fire before a single shot was fired. A tracer had found leaking fuel and transformed it into a torch. Men inside beat at flames with gloved hands until they simply stopped moving.
Baker didn't run. He couldn't. So he turned toward the fighters, not to attack them, but to deny them the easy kill. A head-on pass with a bomber was insane, but insanity had worked before. He dove slightly left, forcing the fighters to adjust their angle. His gunners roared to life, not with precision, but with desperation. Rounds sprayed sky like sparks from a grinder. One 109 pulled away, smoking. Another wavered, clipped by fragments and vanished into the haze. But the remaining fighters were patient, circling, waiting for the bomber to bleed out. Inside Hell's Wench, the tail gunner screamed that his guns were empty. He was holding receiver handles over weapon mounts like a priest gripping ritual tools. They had fired everything. All ammunition spent. The fighters began another pass. Baker couldn't fight. He couldn't flee. He could only fly, low, erratic, close to trees and terrain, daring the fighters to follow him into the world where mistakes killed. A 109 committed, too aggressive, too fast, and clipped its wing on a smokestack, disintegrating in a shower of parts. The explosion rattled the bomber, knocked out the last functioning radio, and sent a panel of skin peeling from the fuselage like paper. Baker held the aircraft level with 2 fingers, muscles trembling, keeping the bomber flying through will more than aerodynamics. And then, unbelievably, the fighters broke off. Not because they couldn't finish the kill, but because fuel, ammo, and range dictated reality even for predators. They turned back toward Ploesti, leaving Baker's aircraft alone in a sky full of smoke trails, falling debris, and ghostly silence. Baker didn't celebrate. The cockpit smelled like blood and burnt rubber, and the aircraft groaned under every gust of wind. Men counted survivors by looking left and right, not by radio. What was left wasn't a squadron, it was wreckage that still happened to be moving. They had escaped the kill zone, but ahead lay hundreds of miles of hostile territory, worsening weather, and an aircraft that might not survive 10 more minutes of flight. Baker exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on a horizon he could barely see. There was no victory here, just the privilege to continue running.
The smoke over Ploesti had barely begun to settle when the crippled B-24 Hell's Wench, wrapped in flames and shedding pieces of metal like dying feathers, could no longer hold altitude. Baker, burned and barely conscious, gave the only order left: abandon ship. Some of the remaining crew jumped, others hesitated, knowing the parachutes might land them in the hands of hostile troops or angry civilians who had just watched their factories explode. A moment later, the bomber rolled to the side, lost any semblance of aerodynamic control, and crashed in a violent burst of fire and fuel, killing Baker and several of his men instantly. Other aircraft, equally wounded, scattered in desperate individual escapes, with engines coughing smoke, hydraulic lines severed, and wings peppered with holes so wide daylight shone through them. What had begun as a bold, coordinated strike collapsed into dozens of isolated battles for survival. In skies polluted with burning oil, anti-aircraft smoke, and parachutes, there was no front line anymore. Only chaos and the brutal arithmetic of war. Altitude, speed, luck, and death. What followed was a strange mix of triumph and mourning. The refineries of Ploesti were burning, production was crippled, and the strategic goal was technically achieved, but the cost stunned even the hardened planners. Over 50 aircraft destroyed, hundreds of men dead or captured, and entire crews vaporized or scattered behind enemy lines. Surviving airmen spoke of the mission with a tone that was neither heroic nor self-pitying, but hollow, like men who had seen a truth too costly to articulate. Baker was posthumously celebrated as a symbol of determination and sacrifice, yet even those who signed the documents knew medals could never balance the ledger. The mission became a study in contradiction. Tactically daring, but tactically disastrous. Strategically necessary, yet morally punishing. A victory engraved with the texture of loss. In the final tally, the raid on Ploesti did not feel like triumph. It felt like a bill presented to the young and the brave, paid in full with fire, blood, and silence.